thank you all for joining us. I'm not going to give you the whole spiel of who we are, who Sam is. I recognize all three of you from last week. So you're vets, or 2 weeks ago, you're vets in the SJC webinar world. We're going to jump right into the wide world of tree identification and how you can do it. Yeah, I know that Sam sent over some resources that we circulated both out in the chat and earlier this week. So hopefully you had a chance to look at those. I definitely would encourage having them up as we go through Sam's presentation now. They're going to be super helpful references for everything that Sam is running us through. But without further ado, the floor is yours, Sam.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everyone. Sorry for the delay. For the references, yeah, have those open because we'll do some practice tree identification as part of the class, because practice makes perfect. And almost all tree identification books, materials are organized the same way. So the stuff you'll get tonight, you know, even if you don't particularly like these materials, you can take that and use it with any other set of materials. This is the basic skills. So with that said, let me just go ahead and, yeah, we're all set there. Share my screen, and we will dive right in to tree identification. So apologies for any little references scattered about in the material for citizen pruners. I took this from my usual citizen pruner class tree identification part of the class slides. I did make sure I went through the information that SJC had so far from your trees counts, and I did make sure that I had what seemed like your top 5 trees as part of the trees that we'll look at to identify tonight. So that way you can be at least sure that you're focused on the things you're most likely to see. They look a lot like New York cities, few differences here and there. Sorry, in terms of the populations, what you have the most of. All right, so reasons to identify trees, other than the obvious of doing a tree count and a tree map. The first is engagement. So especially as you shift into doing more tree care, a big part of that is getting buy-in from the rest of the community. And a lot of the time, for buy-in, it's as much as getting people to not do bad things to trees as it is to affirmatively care for them. And once you can identify the tree and can identify it for the average person or homeowner or whomever you talk to, once that tree sort of has a name and it's not just a thing, it's, oh, that's a whatever, and then it maybe begins to have a little personality, and then people tend to connect much more strongly with it, and you get much better buy-in. Also, next on the tree care side, knowing what normal for a particular tree is. So how do we know if something's not healthy? Well, we look for it to be not normal. But if you don't know what normal is, how do you know what not normal is? So it's important that we be able to identify trees so we know for that particular tree what normal looks like. Yellow leaves on a tree might be a sign of a problem, or it might just be the way that tree grows naturally in the natural leaf color. Not something we have to deal with so much. This is more if you're actually doing tree planting, but tolerances for particular environmental conditions. So a tree that does better in, say, drier sites or wetter sites, as a simple example. Again, this is on the more the purchasing side, but what we call cultivar selection and pricing. And cultivar is a term we'll use tonight. It's just short for and means cultivated variety. So that means that it's one particular variant on what you would normally see of that tree in nature that's been selected for some reason. For example, different color flowers, bigger than the average, smaller than the average, and in some cases even selected for things like disease resistance. You've actually dealt with cultivars your whole life, you just don't know it. Every time you talk about, say, like a Honey Crisp apple or a Granny Smith apple, those are both cultivars of apple. And in that case, the cultivar is named and selected for its fruit. Another important reason to identify trees is avoiding unwanted or invasive species. You may have species that for different reasons you don't want as part of your tree selection or urban trees. Examples might be something that is messy or drops a lot of fruit. Invasive species could be alien invasive trees. So things like Norway maples is a very common one. Ailanthus altissima, the tree of heaven, is another one. So being able to identify those, especially if you're doing a tree planting project, so you're not accidentally planting something you don't want, because nurseries do sometimes make mistakes. And then this kind of goes back to knowing what normal is, but also pest and disease monitoring, diagnosis, and response. So you've probably heard a little bit about the Asian longhorn beetle. There were a few outbreaks in New Jersey. It was a beetle that was an invasive pest, not native to the US, that was accidentally brought over from China. But it only attacked certain kinds of trees. So if you can identify your trees, that's trees that you don't have to worry about in the population, in your environment, or trees that you do. So its favorite tree was maple. So if you go down the street and you see, okay, this street is 10 oaks and only one maple tree, I can save a lot of time and resources knowing that I only have to worry about that one maple tree. Conversely, I can spend a lot of time and resources in a more focused and efficient manner if I know that when someone calls me worried about maybe it's this insect and I know what the tree is, I can say, no, it's not. We'll skip that. That's just for the binomial names. That's a little technical for tonight. We'll just stick with the common names. So what would we look at to identify a particular tree? Well, you can look at almost anything on the tree. One of the most obvious and almost always the place we start is the leaves, leaf shape, and leaf arrangement. We'll talk about what those are in a little bit. Also, the bark of the tree can be a very useful identification clue for some trees. In particular, the London plane tree, which is New York City's most common street tree, and I know you have plenty of them there too, has that sort of camouflaged looking flaking bark on it. So that makes it easy to identify. Fruit, or the seeds or the reproductive structures on the tree, can be another clue. If you've ever seen those kind of brown, spiky, very tough balls that fall off of trees, and kids sometimes throw them at each other, then you know your tree is a sweet gum tree. Tree shape and tree size can also be a clue, or at least help you determine that something might be one or a group of trees, or eliminate a different group. Tree location, and we'll talk about this more in the next slide, but where is the tree located can give you clues. And anything else odd or unusual about the tree that seems to defy your expectations of what a tree would normally be. So for tree location, these are two different photos of the High Line in New York City, the famous rail line that was converted to a park. That's obviously the before on the left and the after on the right. But this is where tree location comes in, because before, that's pretty much just I don't love the term weeds, but that's pretty much just a weed patch. Whatever winds up there is what's growing there. So what I would expect to see there is some of the more common trees that are sometimes called volunteers or weeds, because they tend to spread aggressively. So things like that Norway maple again, the tree of heaven again, maybe black locust, princess tree might be another one. So that's all things we might expect to see there. Versus on the right, where it's being maintained as a park, what's going to be there? And what's the only things that are going to be there? Whatever was on the planting plan. So that can be a good clue, a good way to set of clues for you, in that you look at something like an urban street tree bed, almost certainly you can reduce it down to one of those trees on your particular city's tree planting list. Though every so often somebody sneaks something in when nobody's looking. So, unusual features on a tree. So looking at the tree on the left there, yes, that is a purple tree, and that is in Central Park. That is in fact, if you look at Google, if you look on Google Maps on the satellite photos, if you've got the tree like sort of any time when leaves are out, you can normally find that tree in Central Park. It's up by about 84th Street on the western side of the Great Lawn. But any kind of unusual features like that can help you identify a tree. And looking at that photo on the right, those leaves aren't sick, even though they might look it. That's something called variegation. And variegation is just having white edges or patches, or even in some cases almost totally white or yellow leaves on the tree. So that can help you identify that particular tree. Now, on to the nitty-gritty of identification. We're always going to start identification with the growth pattern, opposite and alternate. So for that, you're looking at the position of the buds and the leaves. If the leaves are right across the stem, the main twig of the tree from each other, we say they're opposite. If they go left, right up the stem, we say they're alternate. Tree naming and botanists are very, very literal people. In terms of our street trees, there tend to be a lot more alternate than opposite trees. So if you see an opposite tree, that's a good clue to start with that you can use to narrow down a lot. Probably the main group of our opposite trees would be the oaks. Excuse me, not the oaks, the maples. Sorry, I'm looking at the picture of an oak here and thinking maple. Sometimes, though, especially on older trees or slowly growing branches, you can have those alternate growth pattern, but the amount that the tree grew is so small that it's very hard to tell if the leaves are actually opposite or alternate. So like looking at this red oak, you can see that there's a lot of leaves on there, like right here, that even though they're actually alternate, they look opposite because the gap between the spaces where the two leaves are is so tiny on that very slow growing twig. So that's why when you're doing opposite and alternate on a tree, it has to be one or the other. It can't be both. And it's best to look around the tree, if you can, at a couple of different branches or spots and say, okay, what am I seeing? If it looks like it's opposite in 3 places and alternate in 1, maybe a leaf died and fell off or something like that. So once we've got our opposite and alternate, the next thing we're going to look at is the leaf simple or compound? And if the leaf is simple, it just means that the blade, that flat green part of the leaf, is in one continuous piece, like the leaf on the left here. Again, that's another red oak leaf. If the leaf is compound, the blade is divided into multiple individual little leaflets, like the black locust leaves on the right here. You cannot rely on just leaflet size as a reliable predictor of if something is a leaf or a leaflet. Some trees can have very large leaflets, and some trees can have very small individual leaves. For example, I don't know if Jersey City uses it, but the Parks Department here does. There's a tree called lacebark elm that has individual leaves, but they are smaller than the leaflets on most compound leaf trees. So on the compound leaf tree, everything in the red circle there, that whole structure is one complete leaf. That's an important distinction because when we talk about opposite and alternate, we only talk about whole leaves. We don't talk about if those individual leaflets are opposite or alternate, because it is fairly common to have both opposite and alternate leaflets even on the same leaf. So talking about those compound leaves a little more, there's 3 terms for the arrangement of parts. And we talk about it mostly in terms of those compound leaves, but we can use them for other things too. So left to right, the first one is palmate, and that means everything just originates from one central point, just like, of course, all your fingers originate from your palm. There is pinnate, which means everything branches left and right off a central stem. And then there's bipinnate, which is just that pinnate, that same pinnate pattern, and bi, of course, repeated twice. So you have side stems off of a central stem, and then the leaflets, or whatever it is, will actually be on those side stems. Bipinnate compound leaves on trees are very rare. In New York City, we have about 350 or so different species and cultivars on our approved street tree list, and there's 2 that are bipinnate. So using those terms to talk about leaves, this is usually the first place we start, is that if we have a compound leaf, is something palmately compound or pinnately compound? So palmately compound is on the left there, the horse chestnut, and pinnately compound on the right, the green ash. So with palmately compound, all those leaflets originate from that one central point, and in pinnately compound, all the leaflets branch left and right off of a central stem. So we've got opposite, alternate, simple, compound, and then we've got some terms to describe compound. And the next thing we'll look at is the edges of the leaf margins. So if the leaf margin is smooth, we say it's entire. If it's toothed, if it has what looks like little saw teeth on it, we say it's toothed. Because again, those tree people are really literal and very creative. And then if it has big bumps or projections, we say it's lobed. So on the right there, you can see that leaf has both those 5 big points on it, or big star-like projections, so we say that's lobed. And then it's you can see the smaller teeth on there too, so that is toothed and lobed. And that's a case where we would say not only is it lobed, but we can use those descriptions about arrangement again. So we can say it's palmately lobed, because if you follow that central line down each of the lobes, it all comes back to one point on the leaf. So still talking about the leaf margins and toothed. So we've got toothed again there on the left. And then on the right, the elm leaf, we have a pattern that's called double toothed. So you can, if you look closely, you can see there's a pattern of both larger teeth and then smaller teeth on the larger teeth. And again, double toothed is one of those things that's very rare. We have out in New York City's list, there's elms, and which is about 4 or 5 species that maybe get planted as street trees, and then hornbeams are the only things that are double toothed. And then finally, leaf shape. And there's a whole bunch of technical terms for leaf shape if you look in the books that deal with it seriously. We'll just use very general terms. So you can see you've got that very obvious heart shape or spade shape on the left there, and that is a red bud. We've got that very odd sort of four lobes shape in the middle. That's a tulip tree. And then on the right, we've got this, not really a football shape. It's more like a sort of elongated heart, kind of. And that is a hackberry. Notice also the leaf base on the hackberry, especially the leaf on the right, and the base of it right there, you can see is uneven. So that's another good thing to keep an eye out for. With those sort of vaguely football-shaped leaves like on the right, that's a tricky group of trees. There's a lot of trees that have leaves like that, and one of the things we can use to distinguish it is ask ourselves, where is the leaf widest? Is it widest closer to the base of the leaf where the little leaf stem attaches like these, or is it widest right in the middle of the leaf? All right. Since I am a firm believer that the only way to get better at tree identification is a huge amount of practice, we can start using some of these leaf terms. And when I started at Trees New York, I did not get a huge amount of support in learning how to identify trees. I basically sort of got handed the book, and it was, well, there you go, and good luck, figure it out. And I can still tell you which tree in Central Park, and it's a white mulberry, was the tree that I started trying to learn leaf identification on. So what could we say about this leaf? Now, obviously, we can't say if it's opposite or alternate because we can't see the rest of the twig, so we don't know, does it have another leaf right next door to it or not? So, but what can we say about this? And feel free to unmute yourselves and just jump in with suggestions. So moving on from opposite and alternate, is it simple or compound? Simple, yes, excellent. What about the margins? Entire, toothed, lobed? Toothed, excellent, yes. And then looking at the base of the leaf, it's not very obvious here, but it's a little bit uneven. And this is a linden leaf. So simple to roughly heart-shaped, sort of, mostly, and then an uneven leaf base. And I should add widest in the middle, too. How about these? You always start at opposite or alternate.
Opposite.
Excellent. Yes, opposite. And there's you can see the opposite stems right on the very right side of the picture here. So then looking at it, is it simple or compound? Is the blade in one continuous piece?
Simple.
Simple, yes. Then we could add that it is palmately lobed again. So we can see it's got usually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lobes on it. And in this case, we can even say that it's got a few very large what on the lobes too. Those big points, they are technically still teeth. So we'd say it has a few large teeth on the lobes too. And this is a Norway maple. All right, little bit different thing here. This is a kind of a trick photo. It's taken from the top down. It looks like this tree, its leaves are opposite because it's only got like 4 of them because it's a tiny little seedling, but they're actually alternate. What else could we say about these leaves? Simple or compound?
Simple.
Yes, excellent. Simple. So simple. They're lobed. See, we've got all those big bumps on the side. Those are technically lobes. So we've got it's lobed. And then in this case, we've seen a bunch of palmately lobed, but in this case, it is pinnately lobed. See how if you follow the line down each of the lobes, it all just comes right back to that central stem on the leaf, but it doesn't all come back to the same spot. So it is pinnately lobed. And this is a swamp white oak. All right, so I clipped a few trees that the numbering on the trees here might be slightly out of order because I removed a few trees so that the presentation didn't get too long, and so that I had space to make sure that I got Jersey City's more common trees. Sorry, I thought I had another slide of this. So I just told you what it was anyway. So this is the honey locust. This is one of the 2 bipinnately compound street trees, and you can see that right up there on the leaf on the top left. Because that's one complete leaf, so it's got that central stem, then it's got the side stems that branch off that central stem, and then the leaflets are on those side stems. The leaf underneath that is just pinnately compound, and this is a tree that will have both compound and pinnately compound leaves on the same branch, or even on the same leaf. I've seen situations where you'll have one of those compound leaves, and then one leaflet will be deleted, and there'll be one of the little side stems there, and the leaflet's on that. A good clue sometimes for these is on the right picture. You can see those really big sharp thorns. That's a common problem with honey locusts, is they get those thorns all on the branches and the trunk. Usually cities will have the thornless variety, so you should see very few or none of those. But the thornless variety or thornless cultivar is still grown on regular wild honey locust rootstock. So you might see the tree and it looks okay, and then you see the some root suckers, some what look like new little branches coming up from the root system, but the root suckers will have the thorns on them because the root suckers are that wild honey locust rootstock that grows the big thorns. On the right, you can see the trunk with the thorns, and on the left is the fruit. The thornless one also gets very little or no fruit. So the fruit is, in this case, it's green because it hasn't dried yet, but it's that flat, twisted seed pod. And then as that dries up on the tree, it'll turn brown and then eventually fall off the tree. All right, so tree number 3. This is so try this one on your keys. This is a pretty common one. Actually, this is a very common urban street tree, so this is a good one to know.
Can confirm there's at least 7 on my block.
And we can walk through identifying it on the as we go if people would like.
Yeah, but if anybody in the crowd has any guesses, don't hesitate to speak up or add to the chat as well.
So is this opposite or alternate? The left photo here is the one to use for that.
Alternate?
Alternate, yes. Simple or compound?
Simple.
Simple, yes. In this case, the leaves are, I know it's hard to see on these, but they are subtly toothed, but they are toothed. It's kind of a blunt tooth on them. And in the right photo, you can see we've got the clusters there of those little fruits. That's about as big as they'll ever get and what they look like. And again, this is one of those sort of alternate kind of oval-shaped leaves that's super common. It's hard to, these can be a little tricky to identify. This is Callery pear. Now it's called Callery pear. It is actually related distantly to the pears that you would buy in the supermarket, which occasionally, much more in the past, only very occasionally now, are actually grown on the roots of this tree, on the rootstocks of this tree when they're growing a particular pear cultivar. A good identification clue for these, and you can go out and look for it right now, is on the left photo. See those big tan fuzzy buds on the tree? Those will usually be half an inch long, give or take, so they're very obvious. They're an excellent identification clue to look for right now because they'll keep those buds all through the winter up until the leaves come out, and those buds will be where the leaves and the flowers come from. This is also one of the first trees to flower in the spring, usually for us, because it's temperature and weather dependent and more temperature than anything, but usually for us sometime in early to mid-April, depending on what the weather's doing. And it's gets lots and lots of white flowers on it. Unfortunately, that's where the attractiveness ends because the white flowers don't smell very good. And there it is, Callery pear. All right. Our next tree. So looking closely, we see that this is actually opposite or alternate. This is tricky because this is alternate. There's this kind of little extra piece right at the base of the leaf where the leaf joins the stem. Sometimes you see that with these trees and sometimes you don't. But because there's no leaf stem, like if you look at the pictures on the right side here, excuse me, on the left side, there's no leaf, there's no matching leaf on the other side of the stem, so this is alternate. The leaves again have that strongly palmately compound shape, and they've got those big points and big teeth along the edge. The easy giveaway for this tree is the bark. You can actually kind of see it on the left side there with that flaking kind of camouflage looking bark. And this is the London plane tree. Now, this is one of those places where those pesky, complicated binomial scientific names come in very handy. Platanus are the plane trees, and then Acerifolia. Acer is the genus of the maple trees, and folia-like foliage. So literally maple-leaved plane tree, because the leaves look so much like a maple. When I teach this class for citizen pruners, at least back before COVID-19 and everything, and we do this in person, I would bring in cut specimens from trees, and almost every class I would fool at least someone looking at this into thinking it was a maple, because the leaves look so maple-like. And then they would just forget to check if it's opposite or alternate. All the maples are opposite. All right, tree number 6. I have struggled to find or get good pictures of these trees, so I'm just going to walk you through this without a whole lot of having you look at it. Just because it's a good tree, it's a very common, it's worth knowing. This is silver linden, Tilia tomentosa. So looking at the right photo here, you can see that it is alternate. Simple leaves, kind of widest in the middle. I think you can see, especially that one small leaf turned over on the right there, that these have an uneven leaf base. And among the lindens, this is the only one you'll see that has that really pale white color. It's actually caused by lots of little hairs on both the underside of the leaf and on the new twigs. It's on both, and that's a good identification clue among the lindens, because all the linden leaves can look pretty similar out in the field. But very common as a street tree. And especially if you're doing tree care, you can mark this down. It is very normal on lindens for the leaves to start to go brown, like around the edges of the leaf, by middle of the summer, August or so. And that is not necessarily a sign that the tree is lacking water. Normally it is, but with lindens in urban environments, I think it's just a little too hot for them to be really comfortable. And that, we call it marginal leaf scorch, or brown edges to the leaf. That's pretty normal for them in an urban environment, even if they're doing okay in hot summers. Just add the name in there. So another linden again. It's amazing. You can. It wasn't that hard to find good pictures of everything else, but the lindens. Oh. This is my stand-in for American linden, and it looks a lot like the silver linden, just without that silver color on the underside of the leaves or the twigs. One thing to definitely note here is, if you take a look at the left side of the picture, the picture on the right, note that between the veins in the leaf, you see a lot of other little impressed veins there. Almost look like someone, took like a pencil or something and traced a lot of little lines on the top of that leaf. That's a good identification clue among the lindens for American linden, because they're typically the one as a street tree that has those strongest amount of those impressed lines on the top of the leaf. There's another clue we'll talk about in a minute. And then this is the final of our 3 lindens. And yes, I put them all together because they can be a little tricky to figure out as a group. And this is little leaf linden, or Tilia tomentosa. If the tree, I would say generally, and Dan, you may have better numbers on this from your tree map, but if the tree looks like a linden and it doesn't have that white underside, it is almost certainly little leaf linden. They are very common. They've been planted for a long time. not American linden. Despite the name, you cannot rely just on leaf size to identify little leaf lindens. A small American linden leaf can be smaller than a big little leaf linden leaf.
Yeah, that sounds right to me from our street experience. And I'll also say that I think that little leaf linden is even much more common even than silver as well.
Yeah.
Probably the most common linden that we see.
Okay. Now, if you really want to get fancy, the way to distinguish these trees is you want to turn the leaf over and look on what would be the bottom of the leaf where the leaf stem joins the leaf. If it looks like over on the right there, and you see when earlier in the summer they'll usually be white. As the leaf has more time on the tree, they'll start to turn tan. If you see that little cluster of tan fuzz on the bottom of the leaf where the leaf stem joins it, little leaf linden. If you don't see it, like the leaves on the left there, American linden. So that's the pretty much 100% clue. Okay, tree number 9. And remember I said that sometimes leaves will be tricky with that pinnate and bipinnate thing. So looking at the leaves on the left there, you can see that the first 2 leaflets are pinnate, and then the leaf turns bipinnate. And we've got some of those kind of stubby, flattened brown pods. Looks like it could be the pods look a little bit like the honey locust pods, but they're thicker and they're much, much shorter. They're usually somewhere between like 4 and 6 or 7 inches long. And the bark is kind of distinctive. You see where it's peeling up there. It kind of has that orange tone or color on the youngest bark, kind of down in the cracks there. This is alternate, and this is Kentucky coffee tree. Beginning probably 2010, 2012, something like that, New York City Parks Department suddenly, discovered or rediscovered this tree and started planting a lot of it, and it's much more common as a street tree now than it was back then. One good way to identify this in the winter is that these have almost no small twigs on them. That's actually a water-saving strategy for the tree in nature. And as a result, if you see a tree that looks like it's kind of dead and all the little twigs broke off it and it doesn't have them, there's be suspicious of Kentucky coffee tree. All right, let's try tree number 10 from your keys, just because this one these can be tricky and challenging, and it's a good one to try because it's one of those kind of oval or football shaped leaves. So looking at the leaves on the right, opposite or alternate? Excuse me, not the right, sorry, I keep getting this backwards. The left.
Alternate.
Alternate.
Alternate, yes, absolutely. Simple or compound?
Simple.
Simple. Mm-hmm. What about the margins?
Toothed.
Toothed. These are toothed if you look carefully, and again, this varies by leaf and by tree with these, but they are actually subtly double-toothed. There's kind of some bigger gaps between the teeth and the leaf there. And they have these very deep vein impressions on the top of the leaf. you'll probably see them with these funky little clusters of what are actually the fruit that you see in the middle. And the bark of these is usually gray and very smooth. Any ideas from your keys? This is a tricky group to identify, so even if you don't get it right, practice is good.
Is it an elm?
Elm. It's not an elm, but that's certainly close based on all the leaf stuff. Yes. See, the elms typically have uneven leaf bases, and these are pretty even. But an elm is about as close as you can get without being right. All right, and I'll go ahead.
Beach.
Ooh, American Beach. Yep, that's another good one. Yep, very, very close. Go ahead and tell you this is European hornbeam, Carpinus betulus. Now, I'm being a little bit unfair with some of these because we're only seeing these individual little pieces of the tree. In some cases, if you see the whole tree, it can make it much easier to figure out. These have a very narrow, dense, upright shape usually, which is the version that most cities plant because that tends to keep the tree up and out of the way. There is usually a temptation to put these in sort of narrow streets or smaller spots without realizing how large these can get at full maturity. So I think a lot of parks departments will be in for, a little bit of an unhappy surprise in another 30 years or so. But again, these were not, these really came in about that same time, maybe about a decade ago. You started seeing these as street trees, and a lot of places have started planting more of them. I think in part because it's been a tree that's been around for a long time. It just tended to go into private property. So nurseries are good at growing them, and they can grow them cheaply. Tree 11, another very, very common street tree. This one, it's hard to tell, so I should just tell you. This is alternate.
It's got those trademark very deep lobes.
Mm-hmm. Technically, and again, this goes back to, leaf people can get unbelievably detailed about this stuff, but the gap between the lobes is the sinuses. But, I don't even have all the leaf terms down, so don't worry about it.
No, this is the place, Sam. We want the right terms for posterity.
And incidentally, this shape this leaf shape is very typical for this group of trees, just like those palmately lobed leaves were very typical for the maples. Anyone have any ideas from your keys? All right, this is pin oak. And this is what most people think of as a very typical oak shape. There's a couple of different trees that cities are starting to use that can look a lot like this. Here's this one. We've actually already seen this already, and these again are not great photos. This tends to be one of those trees that have those really short growth increments, and it can be, or it gets to them, and it can be hard to tell if the leaves are opposite or alternate. This is swamp white oak. I should add, looking at that picture on the lower right, see how all those brown leaves are on the tree, are still on the tree? A lot of oak trees will hold on to some or most of their leaves through a good portion of the winter. And that's normal. So if you see an oak tree, excuse me, especially now with a lot of leaves still on it, that's not a tree with a problem, that's normal. Another good clue for the swamp white oak, why it's called the white oak, is when you turn that leaf over, like in the top right photo, it's got that very pale underside, and if you rub it, it feels like velvet. So another good identification clue for these. That's not just, you know, leaves in the visual. All right, here's one of your SJC trees that I put in special. So even though the picture on the left is very deceptive because I think they took some leaves off to make it all fit better in the picture, this is opposite. So simple or compound?
Simple.
Simple, absolutely. And what about the margins? Toothed, lobed, entire?
Looks toothed.
Toothed? Yep, toothed and technically lobed. So those big points again are the lobes. And palmately lobed, because again, if we follow those lines that from the tip of the lobe back, they all come back to the same place. Anyone have any ideas which tree this is?
Maple.
Yes, maple,
Red
and
maple.
not just a excellent red maple. Yep, you got it. Another good clue for these, the books sometimes mention it and sometimes don't. There's two. One is that the bark on these trees is a very light gray, and it stays smooth for a long time after the trees are planted. They do eventually get rough, but it stays smooth for a long time. And then the other one is that the leaf stems of the red maple, they're green when the tree first starts to grow, but then they pretty quickly turn red and stay that way all summer. So that's another good identification clue. So here we have a nice proper opposite tree again.
What's a classic leaf shape?
Is it Norway maple?
2 for 2. Norway maple. Excellent. And another identification clue for Norway maple, it's that bottom middle picture there. If you pull the one of the leaves off the tree, and then you run your fingers up it, squeezing it towards where it was attached, you'll see some sap there, and the sap in these is white. So you can see it on the leaves there. So that's another clue if you're not sure. Really, the only maple that's going to have maybe a similar leaf to this is sugar maple. But sugar maple would be incredibly rare as a street tree. They typically do not like street tree bed conditions. I won't say never, because I know where there's some in Brooklyn where someone brought some down from upstate and just put them in tree beds because he we met him and he told me he did. But, you know, I mean, that was back in like the early 80s too, and things in the city were a little rough, and people kind of just helped themselves when they could. So, yep, Norway maple. There is also a very common purple leaf version of this tree, so don't be surprised if you see these with purple leaves. #14 is a pretty easy one, with that famous fan-shaped leaf. And on the right there, the fruits that are notorious for smelling bad when they get crushed on the sidewalk.
Yeah, ginkgo.
Ginkgo, absolutely. Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. Let me walk you through a few of these, because these are kind of the trickier ones. Obviously, this is alternate. It's that football shape again. And on these, if you look at the margins, see how it's got those big teeth that kind of curl down, and the point stays very close to the leaf and points towards the tip? This is the Japanese Zelkova, or Zelkova serrata. If you see these out in the field, almost always people are planting the upright versions of these, so the tree will actually look like it's doing the Y in the YMCA, and all the branches will be pointing more or less up at some angle. Tree 16, we actually saw this in the beginning, and I mentioned it as one of our double-toothed trees, and this is the American elm. There are disease-resistant cultivars. These famously, the regular species got very hard hit by Dutch elm disease back in the middle of the 20th century. But typically the ones you see now will be disease-resistant cultivars that have been developed. #17. This one's a little funky looking leaf. These are actually compound leaves, pinnately compound, but you can see the leaflets have teeth, and even at the base of them, on some of them on the right there, almost kind of lobes on them. So this is just a reminder to, you know, trust your own skills in tree identification when you see it. This is golden rain tree. And 18, very common. These kind of football-shaped leaves, and you'll notice they have these very long, kind of feathery teeth, but very small around the edge of the leaf, that again point forward. And usually with that, if you look at the ends of the leaf, notice how long and drawn out the tip of that leaf is. And these are Japanese flowering cherry, or Prunus seriolata. There's a couple different versions and varieties of these and things like that, but you know, that gets very technical if you want to break it down super fine into which is which. And then another one just for Jersey City. New York City plants a little bit of this. They probably 5-6 years ago, they were planting more of it, but I think it did not do incredibly well as a street tree, at least in tougher sites. So they kind of, you don't see a whole lot of this planted as a street tree. This is serviceberry. These can be tricky to identify because the leaf shape can be very variable on them. Sometimes you get sort of rounder, more oval leaves like you see on the left, and sometimes, excuse me, more oval leaves like you see on the left, and sometimes you get rounder leaves like you see on the right. A good identification clue for these, because again, these have that kind of generic sort of round toothed leaf shape, is if you look on the left and you look closely at the bark there, you can see the bark is like this light gray, and it's got this kind of snakeskin pattern with all these little vertical lines on it along the stem. That's a really good identification clue for serviceberry bark, especially on something that's a street tree. And there is your cute picture of a hedgehog, because this is a lot of work. There's a lot of terms, and tree identification is not easy. If you are, if you practice a little bit of this or whatever and feel frustrated, that's okay. You probably should. Can be complicated and tough, and a lot of it is just repetition and practice.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you everybody else for participating. Margaret, you're like our MVP here, clearly, like went for the hat trick. Very impressive. But no, yeah, thank you so much for walking us through that, and for adjusting the slides to contain some of our more typical trees here. If I
oh yeah, well, I want to make sure I'm doing something useful.
No, very, very useful, very useful. All these trees are definitely ones we've encountered already in our mapping. I'm sure we're going to keep encountering. I know that we've run over, but I do want to give everybody a chance to ask any questions if they have any, either on anything that was covered, or if they have other kind of questions that have come up in their own attempts to ID trees. Yeah, Jenna, Kiana, Margaret, do you have any questions for Sam? If not, go for it.
Sure. I would add, you have a very good resource in that you've already started your mapping. So you have a collection of trees that people can refer back to as reference trees for, okay, this is what this looks like, or this is what that looks like, that are already identified. So that's a big help too.
Yeah,
so that's a tool for people to keep in mind for, because by the time spring gets here, and some of this stuff can definitely slide out of your brain a little.
No, totally. And it's true. It's already been a help even last season, just kind of being able to refer a bit. So that's definitely something to think about. Something that comes up for me, at least, I know, and you kind of brought this up at the end with the serviceberry. All of these features, right? The bark, the leaf shape, the leaf ends can be so variable even across one tree. It cracked me up on the American linden picture. There was like, on the right was that perfect picture with the uneven leaf end, and then on the left there were like three perfectly kind of in leaf ends. I'm just curious if you have any kind of advice for, especially as you're getting started, determining when you look at a tree, how do you know what is and isn't standard? Is it just a matter of time? Is it just a matter of experience? Yeah.
I would say that the easiest way to do it is almost all the books out there, they kind of go for like the middle 50% of what you'll see on a tree. So as much as you can, look around at a couple different, not just individual leaves, but branches and spots on a tree. I realize on a big tree that's not necessarily possible. But as much as you can, and try to take an average of what you're seeing on the tree and compare that. There is a tree book. It was written for New York City. It's called like the Guide to the Trees of New York City. The author is Ned Bernard. And it's still in print, I think. And the one advantage of that one is he does tend to include typically 2 or 3 pictures with some leaf shape variability in for each of the trees. It's written for New York City street trees circa 2001. So at this point, there's a lot of stuff it doesn't cover. But if you could find it at the library or something like that, I think there's some used ones out there too, because it was pretty widely printed. It's a good one just in terms of showing some variability in the leaf shape.
Got you. That's super helpful. Yeah, as is the advice of taking like that 50%. Don't just get hung up on one leaf.
And as you know, as a reminder, the world is not going to end because one tree winds up misidentified on a tree map. I'm sure I've got a few misidentifications on New York City street tree map that I oopsed in there. So it happens to everybody.
Cool. No, that's super helpful. Thanks for having us, Jenna. Yeah, if anybody else needs to run, no worries at all. And if you want to come back and refer to this, we have recorded it as well. So, you know, as Sam says, if this slips out of your head come spring and you want to remember some of those photos or some of the sage wisdom, you can check out this recording on the Sustainable Jersey City website. But no, thank you so much for your time, Sam, and thanks everybody else for joining in.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone,
Thank
for
you.
all your
Yes.
hard work for Jersey City's trees.
Thank you. And actually, I just want to say one thing before everyone jumps off. We have one more in our one more webinar in our winter lecture series. 2 weeks from today, we actually have the New York City Park Stewardship team here, and they're going to kind of give us some information on what the biggest threats to urban trees are and what we can do as stewards to mitigate them, both as groups and individuals. So that'll be interesting, and I hope to see everyone there. So that's 2 weeks from today, the 22nd, Monday, again at 6:30 p.m. Same start.